Fantastic. Well, it's lovely to be here. Welcome. I think this is it's an interesting, sort of timely conversation about climate goals and goal setting in the corporate world. We're at quite an interesting moment, I think, both in terms of climate and in terms of sort of corporate ambition. You know, we're in a very different place since a lot of targets were made a decade ago. And at the same time, we have quite a lot of evidence that climate change is moving very quickly. We're potentially at 1.5 degrees in the last few months, which doesn't necessarily mean that we've sort of blown past that Paris target, but it does mean that it's looking sort of dicey as to our abilities to meet it. So I think it's quite an interesting moment to talk about corporate ambitions. So, and we've had some quite high-profile announcements from companies recently that they're sort of not going to. Walmart is one example. Companies that are saying they're not going to reach their targets. So, Sherry, I mean, this is your business. You talk to companies about their climate ambitions. I mean, have companies given up on this, do you think?
Well, first, thank you very much for having this discussion. It's a really important one because we get to build in data to what we're thinking as opposed to actually just picking up sound bites. What we're seeing is that companies are maintaining or increasing their climate ambitions. And again, you know, we can say this from a position of having 2/3 of the world's market capitalization reporting through CDP, over 25,000 companies last year, and we have 1,100 cities, states, and regions, which also encourage the companies that are in their jurisdictions to disclose. So 50% maintained, 40% raised their ambitions. And since we're sitting here in London during London Climate Action Week, let's think about what's happening in the markets here. So FTSE, 93% of the FTSE disclosed through CDP. And what we're seeing is that only 4% amended their targets. Of that, only 2% amended them down. So we are actually seeing that the numbers are not bearing out the trend that says that they're ditching their targets. Actually, last week we opened our cycle. So now, you know, as of last week, we're getting new data in. And what we're seeing is a over 25% increase in companies at this time in the cycle, 1 week in, that is 25% up on last year in terms of companies that are engaging with the disclosure process.
Interesting. Okay, so there's something that sort of goes against the kind of prevailing narrative a little bit there. Laurie, to bring you in, I mean, 1.5 aligned has been a very significant way for companies to define their targets. Why is that an important way? Why has that been an important way to think about climate targets? And do you think it's still a useful way to define them?
So we have the 1.5 target, not necessarily because it is a definitive threshold in how the Earth system behaves, but it's as good as we can get as an approximation of where we would see a major escalation in the risk that is then created in the Earth system. That includes everything from the worsening heat extremes that we're seeing and experiencing, through to the potential for major shocks to food systems, all the way to these climate tipping points that we hear more and more about in the news at the moment. So 1.5 is a good rule of thumb for limiting that risk in the Earth system. Now, we are going to go over it. We will break the Paris goal at some point in the next few years. That will definitively be broken. The latest World Meteorological Organization data infers that this definitive break is probably going to happen by, let's say, around 2028. So we are going to go further into that risk zone. What that means for when it comes to a target is that we will need to ideally still reference back to 1.5 as an anchoring point. How that is done is very difficult because it will require a huge amount of things. One is cleaning up the mess, drawing carbon back out from the atmosphere. That is the thing we need to do to restabilize the Earth system, as well as then becoming more resilient to deal with the consequences of entering that risk zone.
Okay, and we actually have a poll, by the way, which is going to ask all of you what your companies are doing on this, whether ESG is still something that you're talking about a lot. There's also been some discussion of green hushing, so this quieting idea. I mean, why do you think the companies that you talk to are still doing this with everything that Laurie says in mind? You know, why is it something that is still a priority based on what you're seeing?
Well, I have the luxury of talking to many companies, C-suites about exactly this, Olivia. And what I am hearing consistently is that there has been a strategic commitment in terms of not their emissions, but their business. So companies have already embedded some of this, tracking, tracing, targets into how it is that they're planning their business going forward. And we're seeing that bear out in the numbers as well. So often people think about CDP as collecting greenhouse gas emissions data or water usage or thinking about waste, et cetera. But especially over the last 5-6 years, we've been looking at what are the opportunities? How is it that a company can look at not only the risks, which are obviously significant and should be analyzed, but what are the opportunities? And this year, we've seen $12.8 trillion worth of opportunities coming out of the survey. And that is all down to, how is it that we can change our supply chain? How can we lower costs in terms of producing what we already have? How can we integrate lower energy costs across our entire value chain? Also, how can we innovate new products that are going to lean into a sustainable future? And so those are already in train. So part of that is what I'm hearing, which is actually all of that is good business sense. We're talking about resilience. We're talking about great new opportunities. And that's not woke. That's not something about sort of pulling sustainability out and putting it on the sidelines. It's actually already embedded.
But at the same time, I mean, there's a lot of public pressure, especially if you have US operations. The political momentum behind this has very much shifted. It's also shifted to some extent on the investor side. Is that impacting the way that those C-suite executives are sort of thinking about this, that kind of external pressure?
Yeah, those conversations I've been having, and I just referenced, the door was closed. Right? The door was closed. I think that what we're sensing is that the commitment to continuing to surface data, think about how it is used for business, both mitigating risk and looking at opportunities, that's still there. I don't think companies have the appetite to talk about it as much. And actually, in some ways, that's okay. As long as actually what we're talking about is that sustainable business is good business, we can drop the word sustainable. Maybe we're at that pivot point. I think one of the things that we all do need to commit to is the fact that if you don't have the data to start tracking how it is that you are meeting those business goals, where is the resilience, where is the risk and opportunity, how are physical risks changing what it is you do and where you do it, that is actually what we should be starting to focus on, as opposed to perhaps a story, a nomenclature, a narrative that may not be fit for purpose today.
That's interesting, and you can see that we have some data here showing how mentions of sustainability-related terms have shifted. You can see the dynamic there with the US being, there's a fall across the board, but the US is a much more dramatic fall, which I think maybe is a reflection of that sort of differing political environment. I mean, Laurie, would you agree that sort of talking about it less is not that much of an issue, or do you think companies still need to be talking about this?
It depends the domain, it depends the sector, it depends the political context that one particular company is in. I mean, I'm looking at this right now, the graph that we got up on the screen behind us, and I can imagine a similar trend where we don't talk in the first instance about climate continuing. We're seeing it at the moment partly with moves towards renewable energy being an energy security priority for governments, and companies are playing a role in that as well. Into the future, we could see a situation where as physical risks manifest in a way that we don't anticipate, because many of our economic models are very limited in including all of the risks that are building up right now, which gives us a false and benign impression. As that starts to play out, some of the investment opportunities might be ones that support the reduction of emissions, but in the first instance are about a wider range of security issues, not just energy, but the things we need to ensure that societies remain stable and prosperous, even as they are experiencing a world in which we've not just got more weather extremes, but we have more of the cascading consequences. And it is those domino effects, the kind of domino effects we became used to in the context of COVID-19, the energy shock since then, that are really going to characterize what comes next as we head deeper into that 1.5 risk zone. So you can imagine company reporting, talking about investment opportunities that they're going into that, sure, are going to reduce emissions, but because some of those things that are needed to reduce emissions are also those things that can keep society safer and more stable in a much more dramatically climate-changed world.
Mm-hmm. And we were just talking about the US. I mean, when we're talking about risk, it's not just about sort of physical risk, climatological risk, there's policy risk and political risk as well. I mean, is that something that you think companies should be, are they taking that into account, or should they be taking that into account more when they're sort of setting these targets in the way that they think and talk about climate?
I think that yes, they have, particularly in looking at things like transition risk. There's obviously been a lot of focus on that, how we could see rapid changes in policy, and that could affect business operations and profitability. Into the future, we could get weirder and more unexpected types of political dynamics. We can observe one of those dynamics occurring over the last 6 or so months. Let's take Valencia, the unprecedented floods that happened there. You might expect that in the wake of those, we would see a surge toward political support for climate action in response to disaster that was partly driven by climatic factors. But we saw the opposite. We saw a paradoxical situation where the far-right party in Spain was able to capitalize on that event to exploit the anger and dislocation that came from it. We're particularly concerned at the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative that this dynamic, which we call derailment risk, the idea that the worsening consequence of climate change could begin to create conditions that frustrate our ability to deal with the causes of climate change, that type of vicious cycle dynamic could be one of the more unexpected political consequences going forward, because we are entering a much more weird and a much more uncertain world.
Is that reflected in your conversations as well? Is that something that, I mean, our question is, does climate need a new North Star? And we've talked about all of the other things that are not just kind of carbon cutting, but is that something, this sort of derailment risk and all of the cascading things that happen as we start to see the actual physical effects of climate change, are corporations starting to bring that into the conversation more as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely a shift happening, and I'd like to reference 2 different things. One is we did some research earlier this year together with the World Economic Forum and Oliver Wyman, and one of them was to look at market capitalization. So in terms of climate leaders versus laggards over the course of the last 5 years, and of course, because we have the data density in terms of the reporters, we're able to start thinking about this. And what we found was that across all sectors and across all geographies, it was the same sort of market cap increase for the leaders and the laggards. And we took those 2 groups and looked, well, that's not very inspiring, is it? So let's look a little bit further. And what came out of that was that if you look at transport, you actually get a 10 to 12% bump in your market cap because you are a leader versus a laggard. Guess what happens in energy? In energy, it's the flip of that. So the laggards are getting rewarded by 10 to 12% versus the leaders. That's something we should be talking about. That's something we should be thinking about and considering how is that, because that plays into the decisions that are being made by some of the most hardest to abate sectors, the energy sector, the material sectors, et cetera. So I think that there's something there. And I also think that there's something about, actually, that's grounded in today. No one is going to be able to go through a whole week of their life these days without saying AI or hearing AI. And so what is that all about? That's all about jobs, growth, potential, excitement, innovation. Well, AI is a huge suck on energy and on water. So if we aren't actually thinking about how is it the new growth trend is going to affect some of the commitments that these sustainable businesses are making, not just in tech, but in all walks of the society and sectors, this actually could be something that derails perhaps some of the great work that's been going forward. And it doesn't have to. We just need to think about how it is we're conscious of that and really actually lean into what's happening today.
Yeah, and I think that dynamic around energy is really interesting. That's a very interesting stat, and you can maybe see that in the real world with what's happened with BP, and they've not necessarily been rewarded for moving perhaps a bit more quickly than their competitors in the renewable energy direction. I mean, do you think that kind of dynamic shows the limitations of corporate climate action as well? I mean, they are operating within an environment that they often can't directly control in terms of sort of regulation and technology development. Do you think that there's that sort of shows that there's other things that need to happen in order for this to be a sort of meaningful and helpful contribution to climate action?
Yes, into the future, when we do see some of the things, very unexpected and serious things happening, it will, state intervention is going to what's going to be needed, right? We can't really shy away from that. That's not I maybe sound negative in saying that, but we're just into a new climate reality now. That is the symbolism of us exceeding the 1.5 degree goal, and it will require, well, it will lead to more emergency situations, and it will require more emergency responses. We don't necessarily know what they will be. And at the moment, I think if I was in the private sector, one thing that I would be particularly concerned about is that I was not getting enough direction, say, from regulators about how I should be doing some of my climate risk assessment. Because I personally am very concerned about some firms that are using third-party consultants and risk assessments that are giving them a pretty benign idea of what it is going to be like as we head over 1.5 degrees. We can't be in a situation at this late stage where some pension funds have climate risk disclosures that tell them that in a 4-degree scenario, we will see a 1% drop in asset allocation. That does not conform to what the science is telling us about the instabilities and risks that come from the Earth system. Now, what that means going forward is that we need to improve those. Like a ship needs a very good radar when it enters a storm, because we are globally now in that storm. It doesn't mean the game is up. When a ship enters a storm, it doesn't just suddenly sink. It means you're in a much more volatile world. We already know we're in that for other factors like geopolitical risk and interstate conflict and so on. But as the climate element of that really begins to bear, we need very, very good situational awareness. And at the moment, my concern that as we enter that storm, it doesn't look very good in some domains. That ultimately isn't necessarily the fault or the major responsibility of an individual firm. There, I think, needs to be regulation or direction from regulators to say, okay, we are now in a much riskier and less certain world when it comes to the climate. Here are some standards about how the markets for risk assessment need to work, certain scenarios you might all want to look at. We need some of that direction, I think, from regulation to help firms develop that type of situational awareness capability in this storm.
Okay, interesting. And I mean, ultimately, these businesses are sort of motivated by, a lot of businesses will have to think about their shareholders, they'll have to think about their bottom line. How are those kinds of conversations changing within companies? You know, on the sustainability side, are those people able to persuade, the people who look after the money, that this is something that's worth doing, that this is something that is not just going to be a suck or a drag on finances? Is that conversation shifting at all?
Yeah, and I'm going to unapologetically come at this from a disclosure angle. So why do companies disclose? This is not free. This actually takes a lot of investment, and a lot of time, and a lot of focus. And so they do so for 3 reasons. One is access to capital, being part of universes and being able to actually disclose to investors. The second one is business efficiencies, and that includes that your customer is asking you. In fact, that is the most compelling reason why companies disclose, because their customers are asking. And the third is compliance, and this perhaps takes a page from Laurie's book as well. Compliance and policy are driving why companies disclose and why companies are taking actions and making business decisions. So if we look at that, those 3 things together, all of those stakeholders are actually weighing into a business's decision, not only to find the data that they need and where is it they're tracking, how do they set targets, how do they create transition plans. And actually, if we ladder that C, that compliance, up into policy, really actually what we should be calling for is a whole of economy approach. Not just to go to COP30 in a few months' time and talk about NDCs. It's about how does that actually really relate to the businesses that are going on within that jurisdiction, and actually thinking about how you can actually create a meaningful relationship between those policymakers, that clear a direction of travel, and the businesses who are committing to continue their FDI, their jobs, their growth in that jurisdiction. I think if we have that partnership, then we are actually moving forward in a way that isn't isolating or creating any regulatory arbitrage or worries about compliance and where is it that we need to do that. This data set then starts becoming useful for all of those use cases, your investor, your business, your customer, and your regulator and your government. I think that's where we need to start thinking in a bigger picture.
Interesting, yeah, and that kind of global environment is also quite challenging, I imagine, because you might have one jurisdiction who's doing that, and then another jurisdiction who's doing sort of exactly the opposite. Speaking purely hypothetically, obviously. So how do you kind of square that circle? Like, if you're a company that has a leg in both places, perhaps, like, how do you manage, those very competing priorities?
Well, if I can have a quick go, and then Laurie, you can probably shed some more light. I also think that we're talking not only about climate and carbon anymore. We're talking about a whole whole Earth approach, or a whole, how is it that we have nature involved? We haven't talked about that yet, but what we're seeing is a clear increase in the demand for data on water, on forests, on land use, on biodiversity. And these things are not because we're actually extending we would like to do good. It's because these are true inputs into the economy. I think that that's where actually businesses are in very solid ground. And that is where they can actually speak up very clearly. If you have water scarcity issues, if you have a prediction that the land is going to not be able to deliver what you need for products, that is a very clear economic discussion to have. Actually, I think we should welcome that into perhaps that is what's going to lead our way into thinking about how that affects the entire ecosystem and how it is that we can do better with that.
Interesting. And I don't know if we have results from the poll that we did earlier on to see what's actually how that's manifesting with our audience. Laurie, do you have any thoughts on that sort of diverging regulatory environment?
Well, I would more underline what Sherry was saying about how bundling in, or what might to some feel like bundling in nature and other environmental factors is absolutely the right thing to be doing. Looking just at the climate element of the problem that we face is way too narrow. This is an Earth system crisis. It has always been an Earth system crisis. The planet, similar to a human body, has various interacting systems. A climate is only one part of the overall planetary body, as it were. And making sure that we understand the risks that are being created in the other individual components, in the water cycle, in the biosphere, and so on and so forth, is critical to understanding the overall health of that planetary body. So really, from day one, they should always have been bundled in together when you look from the perspective of risk. Because even if tomorrow, suddenly, all emissions stopped, the temperature rise slowed down and no longer continued its onward march, we would still be facing severe crises in those other systems as well. So this is the rational response, globally at least, in the aggregate, to trying to calm those overall risks in the Earth system.